What happens when we place our trust in the wrong hands? Sometimes, we reassure ourselves with, what's the worst that could happen? Only to find we've handed our fate to someone far more sinister than we could have imagined. Now, picture this. Behind the charm of a seemingly respectable doctor lies a mind as twisted as the maze-like building he designed. Not for comfort, but for cruelty. This is the terrifying reality of H.H. Holmes, a man whose true story is more chilling than any fiction. In today's video, we're diving into the twisted legacy of H.H. Holmes, often called the Devil in the White City. We'll explore the dark secrets behind his infamous murder castle, the lives he cruelly extinguished, and the unsettling truth that even now, more than a century later, we may never know the full extent of. As we uncover the facts from fiction, ask yourself, how many more could have fallen victim to Holmes if he hadn't been stopped? All because they trusted the wrong person. Herman Webster Mudgett, who would later become infamous under the alias H.H. Holmes, was born on May 16, 1861, in a quiet town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His parents, Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodette Page Price, were both strict, devout Methodists, and they raised young Herman in an environment where discipline and hard work were heavily emphasized. To the outside world, the Mudgett family appeared as ordinary and respectable. Yet beneath this facade, there were darker undercurrents that would shape the psyche of the boy who would grow into one of America's most notorious serial killers. From an early age, Herman exhibited a sharp intellect and a curiosity that often bordered on the morbid. He was a bright child, excelling in school, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor. While the other children were content with games and mischief, Herman's interests were far more peculiar. He was particularly fascinated by death. This fascination would only deepen over time, becoming an obsession that would drive him to commit unspeakable acts. As a young boy, Herman was reportedly bullied by his classmates. They knew that he was terrified of the local doctor's office, a place rumored to house the remains of dissected corpses. One day, the bullying took a sinister turn when the two older boys dragged Herman into the doctor's office and forced him to confront a human skeleton. But instead of recoiling in horror, something inside of Herman snapped. The skeleton didn't terrify him. It intrigued him. The cold, lifeless bones sparked a dark curiosity within him, an unquenchable thirst for knowledge about the human body and, more disturbingly, the line between life and death. This encounter marked the beginning of Herman's lifelong obsession with anatomy and dissection. As he grew older, his interest in medicine became more pronounced. However, unlike his peers who were drawn to the field by a desire to heal, Herman was driven by a far more sinister compulsion. He wanted to explore the mysteries of the human body, but not for the sake of science or humanity. His desire was rooted in something far darker, a need to control, to manipulate, and ultimately, to destroy. In 1878, at the age of 17, Herman married Clara Lovering, a woman he had met while working on her father's farm. The marriage was a brief escape from his increasingly dark thoughts, but it was not to last. Clara soon discovered that her husband was not the charming, ambitious young man she thought he was. He was prone to violent outbursts, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. Within a few years, their marriage had all but disintegrated, though it would never be formally dissolved. Determined to pursue a career in medicine, Herman enrolled in the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in Ann Arbor in 1882. It was here that he truly began to explore his darker inclinations. While his classmates were focused on their studies, Herman was engaging in far more macabre practices. He began stealing cadavers from the university's medical labs, using them to conduct grisly experiments. But these weren't simply for academic purposes. Herman was also engaging in insurance fraud. He would disfigure the bodies, making them unrecognizable, and then claim they had died in accidents, collecting life insurance payouts in the process. Herman's time at the university was marked by increasingly erratic behavior. He became known for his intense interest in dissection, often spending long hours alone in the lab, meticulously carving up cadavers. His classmates were unnerved by his cold, clinical approach to the human body, and rumors began to circulate about the young medical student with the morbid fascination. But it wasn't just his interest in dissection that set Herman apart. He was also a consummate liar, capable of weaving elaborate stories to suit his needs. He frequently deceived those around him, spinning tales to cover up his darker activities. This skill would serve him well in the years to come, as he embarked on a life of crime that would eventually lead him to Chicago. After graduating from the University of Michigan in 1884, Herman briefly returned to New Hampshire, but the small-town life could no longer satisfy his ambitions. He craved something more, something that would allow him to fully indulge in his darkest desires. He began moving from town to town, working various jobs as a doctor and pharmacist, all the while continuing his schemes. It was during this period that the first suspicious deaths began to follow him. In one town, a young boy who had been seen with Herman vanished without a trace. In another, a woman who had been receiving treatment from him died under mysterious circumstances. These incidents were never fully investigated, and Herman was able to continue his macabre activities without consequence. But he knew that he needed a place where he could operate with impunity. A place where he could build something truly terrifying. A place where he could fully realize the twisted fantasies that had consumed him since childhood. That place would be Chicago, a city that, in the late 19th century, was a burgeoning metropolis, full of opportunity and anonymity. It was a city where people came to make their fortunes, but also a place where many disappeared, swallowed by the bustling streets, never to be seen again. For Herman, Chicago represented the perfect hunting ground, a place where he could reinvent himself and pursue his dark ambitions on a grand scale. And so, Herman Webster Mudgett became Dr. H. Holmes. He arrived in Chicago in 1886, and it wasn't long before he began to lay the groundwork for his most notorious creation, the Murder Castle. This was no ordinary building. It was a carefully constructed labyrinth, designed to confuse and entrap its occupants. It was a place where Holmes could indulge in his darkest fantasies, free from the prying eyes of society. But before he could begin his reign of terror, Holmes had to establish himself in the city. He found work at a local pharmacy, charming his way into the trust of the owners. When they mysteriously disappeared, Holmes took over the business, using it as a front for his more sinister activities. With the profits from the pharmacy, he began purchasing materials and hiring contractors to build his castle, a project that would take years to complete and would cost countless lives. As the murder castle began to take shape, Holmes' appetite for destruction grew. He started luring his victims to his lair, using his charm and good looks to gain their trust before leading them to their doom. Each room in the castle was designed with one purpose in mind: to kill. Some were equipped with gas lines, others with trap doors that led to soundproof chambers where screams would not be heard. The construction of the murder castle was a slow and methodical process, with Holmes overseeing every detail. He hired and fired multiple contractors, ensuring that no one but he knew the true layout of the building. And as the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 approached, bringing millions of visitors to Chicago, Holmes knew that he would have no shortage of victims. But Holmes' hubris would ultimately be his downfall. The very trait that had allowed him to build his empire, his charm, his intelligence, his ability to deceive, would also lead to his capture. The story of H.H. Holmes is one of horror and fascination, a tale of man who sought to play God, only to be brought down by his own evil. When H.H. Holmes arrived in Chicago in 1886, the city was on the cusp of a great transformation. The World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was set to take place in 1893, drawing millions of visitors from around the globe. The city was buzzing with anticipation, and it was this excitement that Holmes capitalized on as he began to lay the foundations for his most infamous creation, the murder castle. Holmes purchased a plot of land at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in the Inglewood neighborhood. The location was strategic, just a short distance from the site of the upcoming World's Fair. He envisioned a grand building that would serve as a hotel for fairgoers, but in reality, it would become something far more sinister. The construction of the murder castle was a project shrouded in secrecy and deception. Holmes, ever the master manipulator, hired and fired multiple construction crews during the building process. This constant turnover ensured that no one fully understood the building's layout or its true purpose. Workers were instructed to build strange, non-functional elements, staircases that led to nowhere, doors that opened to brick walls, and rooms with no windows. These oddities were dismissed by workers as eccentricities, but in truth, they were carefully designed features of Holmes' elaborate trap. Holmes' building was a 3-story structure, with retail shops on the first floor, apartments and offices on the second, and more mysterious spaces on the third. But it was what lay beneath the building that was most disturbing. The basement of the murder castle was a house of horrors, a place where Holmes' darkest fantasies could be realized. The basement was outfitted with a dissecting table, a stretching rack, and a crematory. Holmes had designed the basement to be a place of death, where he could dispose of the bodies with ease. The basement also contained vats of acid and lime, where bodies could be dissolved, leaving no trace of the victims who had the misfortune of crossing paths with Holmes. Holmes was meticulous in his planning. The upper floors of the murder castle contained rooms designed to confuse, trap, and ultimately kill. Some rooms were soundproof, preventing the screams of his victims from reaching the outside world. Others were fitted with gas lines, allowing Holmes to asphyxiate his victims at the flip of a switch. There were also hidden chutes that led directly to the basement, where Holmes could easily dispose of the bodies. One of the most chilling aspects of the murder castle was the sheer scale of Holmes' operation. He didn't just kill for pleasure. He turned murder into a business. Holmes would often seduce young women who would come to Chicago looking for work. He would charm them with promises of marriage or employment, gaining their trust before leading them to their deaths. Many of these women were never seen again, their disappearances chalked up to the transient nature of life in the big city. Holmes' ability to manipulate those around him was extraordinary. He was a man of many faces, a charming doctor, a successful businessman, and a cold-blooded killer. He was able to maintain the facade of a respectable member of society while committing some of the most heinous crimes in American history. As the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition drew closer, Holmes's activities escalated. The influx of visitors to Chicago provided him with a steady stream of potential victims. His hotel, advertised as a place of comfort and luxury, became a death trap for those unlucky enough to stay there. It is believed that many fairgoers checked into the murder castle, never to be seen again. The rooms in the murder castle were designed with precision. Some were equipped with peepholes, allowing Holmes to watch his victims as they struggled to escape. Others had trap doors that would send victims plunging into the basement. The gas chambers were perhaps the most terrifying, as victims would slowly suffocate, unaware of what was happening until it was too late. Holmes would often stand outside the rooms, listening to their desperate gasps for air, reveling in their suffering. One of Holmes' most infamous victims was Julia Smythe, a young woman who had come to Chicago with her daughter Pearl in search of a better life. Julia was lured in by Holmes' charm, and she and her daughter moved into the murder castle. Julia was last seen alive on Christmas Eve, 1891. Her daughter Pearl also vanished around the same time. Holmes never confessed to their murders, but it is widely believed that they were among his many victims. Another tragic tale is that of Emmeline Cigrand, a young woman who came to Chicago to work as a secretary for Holmes. Emmeline was described as kind and intelligent, with a bright future ahead of her. However, she quickly fell under Holmes' spell. He promised to marry her, but instead, he led her to a soundproof room in the murder castle. Emmeline's fate was sealed the moment she stepped into that room. She was never seen again, and her body was likely disposed of in the basement. Holmes' reign of terror continued unabated for years. He was a master of deception, able to avoid suspicion even as people around him began to disappear. He forged documents, manipulated legal proceedings, and even took out life insurance policies on his victims, cashing in after their deaths. His web of lies was so intricate that it took years for the authorities to begin to piece together the true extent of his crimes. But Holmes' arrogance would ultimately lead to his downfall. In 1894, he attempted to pull off a particularly audacious scam. He convinced his business partner, Benjamin Peitzel, to take out a life insurance policy worth $10,000, with the plan being to fake Peitzel's death and split the money. However, Holmes had no intention of letting Peitzel live. Instead, he killed him, staging the death to look like an accident. He then manipulated Peitzel's widow, convincing her to let him take custody of 3 of her children under the guise of protecting them. Holmes' plan was to kill the children and collect additional life insurance money. He succeeded in murdering the 2 girls, Alice and Nellie Peitzel, by locking them in a truck and asphyxiating them with gas. Their bodies were buried in the basement of a house in Toronto. The youngest child, Howard Peitzel, was also killed. His body dismembered and burned in a fireplace in Indianapolis. By this point, Holmes' actions had attracted the attention of law enforcement. Detective Frank Gare was assigned to track Holmes down, and it was Gare's dogged determination that finally brought an end to Holmes' killing spree. Gare followed Holmes' trail across the country, eventually uncovering the bodies of Peitzel's children. The discovery of their remains was the key piece of evidence needed to bring Holmes to justice. Holmes was arrested in Boston in 1894 after being tracked down by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. His capture marked the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. The trial that followed was sensational, with the press dubbing Holmes the Beast of Chicago. Despite his efforts to maintain his innocence, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In the end, Holmes was convicted of the murder of Benjamin Peitzel and sentenced to death. Before his execution, he confessed to 27 murders. On May 7, 1896, H.H. Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Even in death, Holmes remained a figure of fascination and fear. His final request was to be buried in a coffin filled with concrete to prevent his body from being stolen and dissected. This final act of control was a fitting end for a man who had spent his life manipulating and destroying others. The legacy of H.H. Holmes lives on as one of America's most infamous criminals. His murder castle, though long since demolished, remains a symbol of the horrors that can be hidden behind a mask of charm and respectability. Holmes' story is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human soul and the lengths to which someone will go to satisfy their twisted desires. H.H. Holmes is often cited as America's first serial killer, a title that has cemented his place in the annals of criminal history. However, the truth behind Holmes' crimes is much more complex and, in some cases, more ambiguous than popular narratives suggest. Over the years, the line between fact and fiction has blurred, partially due to Holmes' own fabrications and the sensationalist media coverage of his trial and execution. Holmes was a master manipulator, both in his personal interactions and in the way he shaped his own legacy. He confessed to 27 murders, but experts widely agree that this number is likely inflated. Holmes had a penchant for lying, and his confessions, many believe, were designed to enhance his own notoriety. While he certainly killed multiple people, the actual number of his victims remains uncertain. Some historians estimate that the real number could be as low as 9, while others speculate that it could be much higher, potentially over 200. However, the latter figure is often viewed with skepticism due to a lack of concrete evidence. One of the most troubling aspects of Holmes' legacy is the murder castle itself. The structure has been described as a house of horrors, with trapdoors, soundproof rooms, and even torture devices hidden within its walls. But how much of this is true? Well, it's clear that the building was designed with malintent. The more sensational elements of its design may have been exaggerated by the press and later writers. The idea that Holmes' murder castle was a meticulously planned torture chamber has been a cornerstone of his legend. Reports of the time describe a building filled with hidden rooms, secret passageways, and even gas chambers. However, much of what is known about the murder castle comes from accounts written after the fact, often by journalists and authors who are more interested in selling papers and books than in presenting an accurate account of the events. For instance, the notion that the castle contained acid vats and quicklime pits specifically designed for dissolving bodies is based more on hearsay than on verified evidence. While it is true that the basement of the building housed a crematory and a dissecting table, grim features by any measure, other claims, such as the presence of medieval-style torture devices, have been challenged by historians. The reality may be that Holmes' murder castle was more of a product of opportunistic killings and financial scams than the elaborate death factory it's often portrayed as. Moreover, after Holmes' arrest, the building was thoroughly examined by law enforcement, and many of the more sensational claims were not substantiated. The rooms described as gas chambers could have been used for other, less nefarious purposes, and the supposed hanging chamber might have simply been a normal room where a rope was found. Yet the myths persisted, fueled by the public's morbid fascination with the case and Holmes' own talent for self-promotion. One of the more controversial theories about H.H. Holmes is the claim that he was, in fact, Jack the Ripper. This theory gained traction when Holmes' great-great-grandson, Jeff Mugett, suggested in 2011 that his ancestor was the notorious London serial killer. Mugett based his theory on handwriting analysis and the similarities between the two killers' methods. However, this theory is widely discredited by experts. For one, there is no credible evidence placing Holmes in London during the time of the Ripper murders. Holmes was busy establishing himself in Chicago during the period when Jack the Ripper was active in the Whitechapel district. Additionally, while both men were killers, their methods and motivations were vastly different. Holmes was primarily driven by greed, using murder as a means to an end, whether to collect life insurance or to eliminate witnesses. Jack the Ripper, on the other hand, targeted impoverished women in a manner that suggested a different psychological profile, one more focused on sexual violence and power. The theory that Holmes was Jack the Ripper also relies heavily on circumstantial evidence and speculative connections rather than on hard facts. While it's a tantalizing idea, it lacks the solid foundation needed to be considered seriously by historians and criminologists. The sensationalism surrounding Holmes' story has, in many ways, overshadowed the reality of his crimes. Much of what is known about Holmes comes from his own embellished accounts, as well as from newspapers that were eager to capitalize on the public's appetite for lurid tales. This has led to a distorted view of Holmes, where the facts of his life and crimes are often intermingled with fiction. For example, Holmes claimed that he was born with the devil inside him, a quote that has become infamous, may have been more about creating a legacy than revealing any true psychological insight. Holmes was highly aware of the power of narrative and seemed intent on crafting an image of himself as a mastermind of evil. This self-aggrandizing has made it difficult for historians to separate the man from the myth. Moreover, the media's portrayal of Holmes as a supervillain type figure has contributed to the enduring fascination with his story. The image of a handsome, intelligent doctor who built a castle of death is a compelling one, but it's also a simplification. Holmes was indeed a killer, but he was also a fraudster, a liar, and a man who thrived on exploiting others. His crimes, while horrific, were as much about financial gain as they were about satisfying any sadistic urges. H.H. Holmes remains one of America's most infamous criminals, but the truth about his life and crimes is often obscured by myth and exaggeration. While it's clear that Holmes was a dangerous man who committed numerous murders, the extent of his crimes and the nature of his infamous murder castle may not be as dramatic as they've been portrayed. The challenge for historians and true crime enthusiasts is to sift through the layers of sensationalism to uncover the real story, a story that, even when stripped of its more outlandish elements, remains deeply unsettling. The legacy of H.H. Holmes serves as a reminder of the dangers of building up criminals. In creating a legend, we risk losing sight of the real victims and the true nature of the crimes committed. Holmes may not have been the devil incarnate, but he was a man who exploited, deceived, and murdered without remorse. And in the end, that reality is horrifying enough. The story of H.H. Holmes is one that straddles the line between fact and fiction, a tale of horror that has been shaped as much by myth as by reality. Holmes' life and crimes reveal the darkest aspects of human nature, a man who used his charm, intelligence, and ruthlessness to manipulate, exploit, and ultimately destroy the lives of countless victims. While the true extent of his murders may never be fully known, what is clear is that Holmes was a master of deception, building not only a castle of horrors, but also a legacy steeped in mystery and fear. As we peel back the layers of sensationalism, what emerges is a portrait of a man who is driven by greed, an insatiable desire for control, and a chilling indifference to the suffering of others. The murder castle, though perhaps not as elaborate as legend would have it, stands as a symbol of the terror Holmes inflicted, a place where the line between life and death was blurred by one man's twisted ambition. If you found this exploration of H.H. Holmes as haunting as it is fascinating, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that continue to captivate and terrify. Share your thoughts below. Do you think Holmes was as monstrous as history remembers him? Or has time exaggerated his evil? Your perspective adds value to the conversation, and we'll see you on the next chilling tale of the Narrator of the Unknown.